The planet Zaro, once a thriving hub of intergalactic life, lay in ruins. Towering spires that had once gleamed under the twin suns were now nothing but jagged, broken remnants. The air was thick with the scent of ash, and the ground was cracked, scorched by the relentless barrage of destruction. For those who had lived here, this was not just a home, but a cradle of culture and prosperity. Now, it was a tomb. In the heart of this devastated world, a small figure moved cautiously between the shattered remnants of buildings. Her name was Lyra, a Nixie, a race of beings known for their luminous, large eyes and skin that shimmered in shades of lavender. At first glance, one might have thought her delicate, fragile even. But Lyra was anything but. The horrors she had witnessed had hardened her, even at such a young age. Lyra's mind still echoed with the memories of the day everything changed. It had started like any other, with the sun rising over the sprawling cityscape of Zaro. She had been playing in the fields near the settlement, her small feet kicking up dust as she ran, laughing with friends who had long since perished. Then, without warning, the sky had torn open. Giant ships, dark and foreboding, descended in a whirlwind of flames and explosions. The invaders, aliens from a distant star system, had come with one goal: annihilation. They showed no mercy, their weapons obliterating entire cities in mere moments. The ground shook with each blast, sending Lyra running for cover. She remembered the heat of the explosions, the deafening sound of collapsing buildings, and the terrifying realization that she might not survive. She had hidden in the small crevice between two collapsed structures, her tiny body trembling, her breath shallow and frantic. It was there that she had waited for hours, hiding from the chaos that raged around her. When the dust had finally settled, she had ventured out cautiously, only to find that her home, her people, were gone. Weeks passed in a blur. The small girl became a scavenger, searching for anything she could eat or drink in the desolate wasteland. The once vibrant landscape of Zaro had turned into a graveyard. Lyra's clothes had become tattered rags, and her skin grew paler by the day as malnutrition took hold. But it wasn't hunger or thirst that weighed most heavily on her heart. It was the silence. The deafening silence that had replaced the bustling cities, the laughter of her family, and the songs of her people. She was alone. As the days stretched into weeks, Lyra's thoughts became consumed by survival. She learned to avoid the open spaces where the enemy ships might still patrol. Every sound, every shadow sent her into a panic, her heart racing at the thought of encountering the machines that had destroyed her world. The stars, once a comforting sight in the night sky, now seemed like distant beacons of hope, so far out of reach. One day, as Lyra scavenged through the ruins, a distant hum broke the silence. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't one of the invader ships. This was different. Someone, was coming. High above the surface of Zaro, Captain Thorne adjusted the controls of his ship, the Starfire. His ship's AI, Sarah, had detected faint life signs on the surface of the planet, and the data suggested a solitary survivor. Thorne was an experienced spacefarer, a grizzled veteran who had seen more than his fair share of combat and destruction. He had no particular interest in stopping on a planet like Zaro, a place now marked by death. But something about the distress signal had caught his attention. "Are you sure there's life down there?" he asked, his voice low but steady as he peered out through the viewport. "Positive, Captain," Sarah responded in her calm, melodic voice. "I've detected a weak signal originating from the northern sector. It's faint, but it's there." Thorne let out a sigh and adjusted the ship's course. The Starfire descended toward the planet, its engines humming softly as the ship glided over the wreckage of Zaro. As they neared the surface, Thorne's eyes narrowed. There were no signs of life around the crash sites. It was as if the planet itself had given up. The ship touched down with a soft thud, its landing struts sinking slightly into the ashen ground. Thorne donned his worn exosuit, its armor creaking as he adjusted the settings on his helmet. He stepped out onto the desolate planet, his boots crunching against the dust and debris. His handheld scanner beeped faintly in his hand, directing him toward the faint signals of life. He moved cautiously through the ruins, his trained eyes scanning the surroundings. There, in the corner of his vision, he saw a flicker of movement, something small and quick. It darted between the shadows, vanishing before he could fully make out what it was. "Hey," Thorne called out gently, his voice amplified by the suit's external speakers. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, a small head peeked out from behind a broken wall. Lyra's large, luminous eyes locked onto Thorne's. The fear in them was undeniable, but so was the curiosity. Thorne lowered himself to one knee, trying to appear less threatening. He removed his helmet, revealing his weathered face. His eyes were kind, his expression one of compassion. "It's okay," he said softly, offering a hand toward the girl. "I'm Captain Thorne. What's your name?" Lyra hesitated, her small body trembling from both fear and exhaustion. Her voice, weak and barely audible, barely escaped her lips. "Lyra." Thorne's heart clenched. "Lyra," he repeated softly. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe." The man reached into his bag and pulled out a nutrient bar. Lyra's eyes widened, her hand shaking as she took it from him. She devoured it quickly, her emaciated frame trembling with each bite. Thorne lifted her gently into his arms, her tiny body feeling fragile in his embrace. As he carried her back to the ship, Lyra's mind raced. She had been alone for so long, had all but given up hope of ever finding another living soul. And yet here was this strange man offering her help, something she hadn't dared to hope for. The Starfire's hatch closed behind them with a soft hiss. Inside, the ship's eye, Sarah, had already prepared the medical bay. Lyra's eyes widened as she stepped into the sterile environment, the bright lights and unfamiliar machinery overwhelming her senses. But Captain Thorne was patient. He set her down gently on the examination table and smiled reassuringly. "You're safe now," he said, his voice warm and comforting. In that moment, Lyra realized that her world was about to change. She had survived the destruction of her planet, but now she was about to embark on a new journey, one that would lead her into the vastness of space and into the heart of something far greater than she could ever have imagined. The Starfire hummed gently as it sailed through the endless reaches of space. Inside, Lyra sat in the medical bay, her small body reclined on the examination table. The soft, sterile lights above her cast long shadows across the room. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid. The fear that had ruled her life for weeks, months even, seemed to be melting away in the presence of this strange human and his ship. Captain Thorne had been kind to her from the moment they met. His rough, weathered exterior, with its battle scars and faded armor, told of a life filled with hardship. But his eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen more than his share of pain, held a warmth that spoke volumes. They were eyes that saw her, that understood what she had been through. And that made all the difference. "You're doing all right, Lyra?" Sarah, the ship's AI, said in a soothing tone, her holographic form flickering to life beside the bed. Sarah had a voice that was both calming and precise, an artificial warmth that Lyra found strangely comforting. "Your vitals are stable, and the nourishment you've received has already started to help your recovery." Lyra, still weak from starvation, nodded slowly. She wasn't used to being taken care of. She had learned to survive on her own, scavenging what little she could find among the wreckage of Zaro. But here, in this strange, gleaming ship, she didn't have to do anything. Thorne and Sarah had ensured she was safe, something she hadn't dared to believe for a long time. "Thank you," Lyra whispered, though it felt strange to speak the words. She wasn't sure what she was thanking them for exactly. Being found, being saved, or simply being treated with kindness after so much pain. But she said it anyway, because it was the only thing that felt right. Captain Thorne, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the room, smiled softly. "There's no need to thank me," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of warmth. "It's my job to help those who need it, and I'm not about to leave you out here on your own." Lyra's heart clenched at the thought. He had no idea how long she had been alone. The thought of being on a ship with a kind stranger was both surreal and comforting. She had always dreamed of seeing the stars. Her people had talked about them often, about the great expanse of space beyond Zaro's atmosphere. But never had she imagined that one day she would be a part of it. She would travel across the galaxy, leaving the ashes of her home behind with a new family, one she never expected. As the hours passed, Lyra began to recover. She felt the first glimmers of strength returning to her limbs. Sarah's voice guided her as she learned to navigate the ship's systems. The AI showed her how to operate the food synthesizer, a marvelous machine that created warm, nutritious meals at the push of a button. The food was unlike anything Lyra had ever tasted, rich, smooth, and filling. She found herself savoring each bite, feeling the warmth of life returning to her body. Captain Thorne spent his days teaching her how to use the various systems on the ship, explaining how the engines worked and the purpose of the complex navigation charts. He explained it all patiently, his rough exterior softened by the care he showed her. He even shared stories of his own past, of adventures he had undertaken in the vast reaches of space, of battles fought and friends made. Lyra listened intently, hanging on every word. She had never met anyone like him before. His tales of distant planets, strange civilizations, and heroic acts sparked something within her, a yearning for adventure that had lain dormant ever since the destruction of her world. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding purpose, and maybe even a new home. But despite her growing curiosity about the stars, a part of Lyra couldn't shake the lingering dread that still held her in its grip. The vastness of space was beautiful, yes, but also overwhelming. The endless black void outside the viewport made her feel small and insignificant. She wasn't used to being in a place where she couldn't see the ground beneath her feet, where there was nothing but an infinite expanse of stars in every direction. One evening, as the Starfire cruised through a quiet sector of space, Lyra found herself standing by the observation window, staring out into the darkness. The stars glittered like diamonds against the backdrop of black, so far away, so unreachable. The silence of space felt suffocating to her, a reminder of how alone she had been for so long. "Hey, Lyra." Thorne's voice interrupted her thoughts. He had appeared at her side, his presence quiet and steady. "I know it feels strange, but you're not alone anymore. You have me, and you have Sarah. We're in this together." Lyra turned to him, her heart swelling with emotion. For so long, she had been nothing more than a survivor, clinging to life in the rubble of her home. But now, she was part of something bigger. She wasn't just a girl lost in the void. She was a traveler, an explorer, with a future full of possibilities. "I'm not sure I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's so big, so vast." Thorne placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a comforting weight. "It is big," he agreed, his voice low and understanding. "But sometimes that's what makes it beautiful. There's so much out there waiting to be discovered, and you're part of that now. You'll find your place, Lyra. I promise you." The reassurance in his words soothed the turmoil inside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra smiled. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was real. She was no longer the scared, starving girl running from shadows. She was someone who had a purpose, someone who had a chance at a new life. The stars, which once seemed so distant, now felt a little bit closer. Days turned into weeks, and Lyra's strength grew. The ship became her new home, a place where she could learn, explore, and even dream. Thorne's presence remained a steady anchor, his wisdom and kindness helping her find her footing in this strange new world. She had found safety, but more importantly, she had found something that Zaro had taken from her: hope. It was during one of their quiet moments in the ship's common area that Sarah, the AI, announced a new development. "Captain, I've detected an alien vessel on the edge of the system." Sarah's voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "It's sending a distress signal." Thorne glanced at Lyra, his brow furrowing with concern. "We might be able to help them," he said, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Lyra's pulse quickened. A new adventure was unfolding before her eyes. For the first time since the destruction of Zaro, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. The stars stretched endlessly before them. As the Starfire glided smoothly through the vast expanse of space, the ship's engines hummed like a distant song, a comforting and constant presence that reminded Lyra that she was safe. Yet, as the days passed, a new feeling began to stir within her, a sense of anticipation. Thorne had always been calm and collected, but there was something in his eyes now, a spark that hinted at a new challenge on the horizon. Lyra had come to understand that every journey in space was unpredictable. She had learned quickly that space was a vast and mysterious place, full of wonders, dangers, and unknowns. But this time, it wasn't the vastness of space that captivated her. It was the unknown ship on the horizon. "Lyra," Thorne called out from across the room, his voice tinged with excitement. "You'd better see this." Lyra hurried to the bridge, where Thorne stood, his hand hovering over the ship's controls. On the view screen in front of them, a sleek alien vessel appeared, its dark hull gleaming under the light of distant stars. It was like nothing Lyra had ever seen before, curved and organic in shape, with glowing tendrils and bioluminescent markings that pulsed softly against the cold backdrop of space. The ship seemed alive, as if it were breathing in sync with the stars themselves. "That's the ship I detected earlier," Sarah's voice chimed in from the ship's AI system. "It's an Acheron vessel. They're known for their advanced technology, but they've never made contact with humans before." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The Acra were a mysterious race, talked about in hushed tones among the scattered spacefarers that Thorne knew. Their ships were legendary, their abilities unmatched. To meet one of their kind could mean discovering untold knowledge, or facing a deadly foe. Lyra was curious, but also wary. Her people had been victims of an invasion, and the idea of encountering another alien race both thrilled and terrified her. "What's their situation?" Thorne asked, his eyes narrowing as he studied the ship on the view screen. "According to my scans," Sarah replied, "their ship appears to be in distress. Their propulsion systems are failing, and they are drifting helplessly through space. They've sent a distress signal, but it's weak and intermittent. I suggest we offer assistance." Thorne nodded, his lips setting into a firm line. "We can't leave them stranded out here, not if they're in trouble. Prepare the boarding shuttle, Sarah. We'll go help them." Lyra felt her stomach churn with a mixture of nerves and excitement. A rescue mission. Her first real mission as a part of the Starfire crew. Her fingers tingled with anticipation as she followed Thorne down the corridors, to the small shuttle bay where the shuttle was waiting for them. The sleek vessel was designed for quick excursions, with a low profile and enough room for a small crew. Lyra took her seat beside Thorne, who was already beginning the pre-flight checks. "You ready?" he asked, his gruff voice carrying the hint of encouragement. Lyra could tell he had a deep respect for the Acra, even though they were a distant and enigmatic race. This mission was important, not just for the potential information they could gather, but for the lives that might be at stake. "I think so," Lyra replied, trying to sound confident. "But what if they don't want our help?" Thorne chuckled softly as the shuttle's engines roared to life. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The important thing is we're trying. It's what we do." The shuttle's hatch sealed, and they were off, soaring through the vacuum of space toward the Acheron ship. Lyra's heart raced as they closed the distance. The larger vessel loomed in front of them now, its strange, glowing surfaces reflecting the light of distant stars. As they docked with the ship, a sense of unease settled over her. The silence outside was deafening, and she couldn't help but feel small against the vastness of the unknown. The boarding airlock hissed open with a hiss of escaping pressure. Thorne led the way, his steps purposeful and steady, while Lyra followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. As they stepped aboard the Orphaned ship, the first thing Lyra noticed was how different it felt compared to the Starfire. The air was thick, almost alive, and the walls seemed to pulse gently, as if the ship itself had a heartbeat. The glowing tendrils on the walls flickered and moved as they walked through the corridors, leading them toward the heart of the ship. "Stay alert," Thorne murmured as they ventured deeper into the vessel. "We don't know what we're walking into." Lyra nodded, her hand gripping the edge of her communicator. She was trying to stay calm, but the weight of the unknown pressed on her shoulders. As they approached a large chamber, the doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, they found a creature unlike any Lyra had ever seen. The Orphaned was tall, its sleek form covered in shimmering scales of emerald and gold. Its eyes, bright and piercing, regarded them with both caution and curiosity. It moved with an elegance that Lyra couldn't quite understand, its limbs long and fluid, as if the creature were part of the ship itself. It had a commanding presence, yet there was a vulnerability in its stance, something that made Lyra pause. "I am Commander Rax," the Orphaned said, its voice deep and resonant. "And you are the ones who answered our distress signal." Thorne stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, we detected your signal. We've come to offer assistance." Rax regarded them for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered their offer. "Your ship is strange," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I have never seen anything like it." "It's human-made," Thorne replied, his tone respectful but direct. "We might be able to help with your ship's malfunction, but we'll need to work together." Lyra could see the hesitation in Rax's eyes. He wasn't sure if they could be trusted, and who could blame him. She had felt that same uncertainty when she first encountered Thorne, but she also saw something else in Rax's gaze, something softer, a glimmer of hope. "We are willing to accept your help," Rax finally said, his voice steady. "But we must be careful. There is much at stake here." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. What had they just stepped into? What danger lurked in the shadows of this strange, living ship? But despite the fear that gnawed at her, Lyra couldn't deny the excitement that rushed through her veins. This was it, the beginning of a new chapter in her life. And no matter what came next, she was ready to face it head-on, with the help of her new family and the strength she had yet to fully discover. "Then let's get to work," Thorne said, a determined gleam in his eye. "We've got a ship to fix." And with that, the rescue mission began. The tension aboard the Orphaned ship was palpable. Lyra, still reeling from the strange alien world she had entered, clung to the steady presence of Captain Thorne. His confidence was unshakable, but even he couldn't ignore the subtle changes in the air. The Orphaned ship, while breathtakingly beautiful, carried with it a sense of mystery and danger. As they made their way through the vessel's twisting corridors, the eerie hum of the ship's pulse-like heartbeat seemed to grow louder, almost as if the ship itself were anticipating something. The work had begun immediately. Thorne, with his sharp mechanical skills, had already started examining the Orphaned ship's propulsion system. He muttered under his breath as he worked, adjusting components, rerouting power, and analyzing diagnostics. Lyra was stationed nearby, watching intently, but not without a lingering sense of unease. The crew of the Starfire was a small and resilient group, but this was different. This wasn't just about fixing a ship, it was about crossing into the unknown, and what they found could change everything. Commander Rax had remained with them, though his demeanor was more reserved than before. It was as if a part of him still wasn't entirely convinced of their intentions. Lyra couldn't blame him. After all, she had felt that same mistrust not so long ago when Thorne first found her on the ruined world of Zaro. But what choice did they have now? They needed each other to survive in this vast, uncharted galaxy. Lyra's thoughts were interrupted when Rax approached her. His presence was imposing, yet there was something strangely comforting in the way his long, graceful figure moved through the ship. "Lyra," Rax began, his voice calm, yet carrying a certain weight. "You've seen the destruction of your people, haven't you?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Lyra, who had tried so hard to block out the memories of Zaro's devastation, found herself shuddering at the rawness of it. Her skin prickled as the images of the alien invaders, their ships descending upon her planet, flashed before her eyes. "I have," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They came from the sky, like a storm, and we never had a chance to fight back." Rax's expression softened. His eyes, fierce and wise, seemed to carry the weight of his own unspoken history. "It is the same with us," he said quietly. "Our enemies are many, but they are always in the shadows. We fight not just for survival, but for our place in the galaxy. We, the Akra, are not the invaders. Rather, we are a species that has fought for peace for millennia. But peace is fragile." Lyra's brow furrowed as she looked up at him. "Then who are your enemies?" Rax's gaze darkened. "The Khorax," he said, the name like a curse on his lips. "A ruthless and predatory race. They believe in conquest, not peace. They have already taken much from us. I fear they are coming for you too, Lyra." Lyra's pulse quickened at the mention of the Khorax. In her wildest dreams, she never imagined that the galaxy was so fraught with peril. It was one thing to survive the devastation of Zaro. It was another to realize that such destruction might not be an isolated incident. There were forces at play in this vast universe far beyond her understanding. And now, it seemed, she had a front-row seat to the danger that followed every step. As Rax spoke of the Khorax, the lights in the ship flickered, and a low rumble reverberated through the walls. The ship's pulse quickened, and Lyra felt a shiver of dread crawl up her spine. Thorne, who had been engrossed in the repairs, turned sharply at the sound, his eyes narrowing. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm at his waist. At that moment, the airlock doors to the Akran ship slammed shut with an ear-piercing clang, trapping them inside. The alarms blared, red lights flashing, and the ship's calm pulse turned erratic. The vessel groaned as if it were alive, protesting against an invisible force. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen this before, the signs of impending disaster. It wasn't just the ship's malfunction. Something worse was happening. "Thorne," Lyra gasped, her voice shaky. "What's going on?" Thorne immediately began scanning the control panels, his face tight with worry. "We've been boarded," he said, "by the Khorax." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. The Khorax, the very race that had been responsible for the devastation of countless civilizations, including hers. And now it seemed they had come for her again. The reality of the danger they were in hit her all at once. The Khorax were relentless, cunning, and merciless. If they had found them, there was no telling what they would do. Rax's eyes gleamed with fury, his calm demeanor slipping into something more dangerous. "We need to act quickly. They will not stop until they've taken what they want. We must defend this ship. And you, Lyra." Lyra, for the first time in a long while, felt a surge of defiance. She wasn't going to be a helpless victim again. She wasn't going to hide in fear while others fought for her. Her planet might be lost, but she wasn't lost, not yet. She still had something to fight for. And with Thorne and Rax by her side, she had a chance. "How do we stop them?" Lyra asked, her voice steady as she met Rax's gaze. Rax's lips curled into a grim smile, and he nodded. "We fight, but we fight smart. The Khorax may have numbers, but we have something they don't: unity, strategy, and knowledge of this ship." Thorne motioned for Lyra to follow him, his expression filled with resolve. "Let's make sure they regret coming here." The crew moved swiftly, gathering weapons and securing the ship's critical systems. Lyra, though still new to the ways of space combat, felt a firelight within her. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future, for her people, for every soul lost to the cold void of space. As the sound of alien footsteps echoed through the ship's halls, Lyra readied herself for the battle ahead. There was no turning back now. The Khorax had come for her once, and they would not take her again. The fight for the galaxy's future had just begun. The once peaceful hum of the Acheron ship had turned into a harsh, grinding noise. Lyra's heart raced as she followed Thorne and Rax down the narrow, metallic corridors of the vessel, her footsteps heavy with the weight of what was to come. The ship, which had felt so vast and foreign just days ago, now seemed like a labyrinth of endless hallways. Every shadow, every flicker of light, made her jump. The Khorax had arrived, and with them came a terror she had never known outside of the destruction of Zaro. Thorne led the way, his face etched with determination. He was a man of few words, but in this moment, his silence spoke volumes. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his weapons, ensuring every system was ready for battle. Rax, towering over them both, walked in stride, his gaze never wavering from the direction ahead. Lyra, though smaller and more fragile than either of the men, kept pace. She was no longer the frightened girl who had hidden in the rubble of Zaro. The fire inside her had been reignited, and though she had never imagined herself as a fighter, she knew one thing: she was not going down without a fight. The Khorax had been tracking them ever since they entered the Acheron territory. From the moment they had come aboard, their presence had been a looming threat, their dark, shadowy figures slipping through the ship unnoticed, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. "We have to defend the core," Rax growled, his voice low but filled with authority. "The Khorax will target it first. They'll use the ship's power to override our systems if we don't stop them." Thorne nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Understood. Let's move." They reached a cross-section of the ship's central command. Lyra felt the vibrations of distant explosions rattle the walls. The Khorax had breached the outer defenses, and now they were making their way toward the heart of the vessel. With each step, Lyra's breath grew heavier, her chest tightening with anxiety. Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the ship. The red lights flashed even brighter, and an automated voice echoed through the speakers. "Warning. Intruders detected. Security lockdown engaged." Lyra's heart pounded in her ears. The Khorax were inside. "They've breached the central command," Thorne muttered. "They're moving fast." "Not fast enough," Rax said with a grim smile. He moved toward a nearby console, his claws expertly tapping across the control panel. A low hum filled the air as a set of automated defense turrets came to life, swiveling into position. "Those should give us a few extra minutes," Rax said. "We're not out of the woods yet, though." Thorne pulled his blaster from its holster, checking the power settings. He glanced at Lyra. "Stay close," he said firmly. "We'll handle this." Lyra nodded, her nerves shaky, but there was a resolve in her that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just going to hide in the shadows. If the Khorax wanted to take her, they would have to go through her first. As they made their way deeper into the ship, the sounds of battle intensified. The Khorax were getting closer. The distant thud of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallways, the unmistakable sound of their armored boots pounding against the metal floors. Their voices, deep, guttural, and angry, carried through the walls. "They're getting closer," Rax said under his breath. He looked down at Lyra, his face serious. "You need to trust us. When the time comes, don't hesitate." Lyra met his eyes. There was no time to question. There was only action. "I won't." Thorne, ahead of them, signaled for them to stop. The corridor ahead was silent, but the air felt thick, heavy with the expectation of something terrible. They were close. Then, without warning, the first Khorax warrior appeared, a hulking figure with thick, reptilian scales that glistened under the artificial lighting. It was armed with a vicious-looking plasma blade, its red eyes fixed on them with deadly intent. Thorne raised his weapon, taking aim with swift precision. "Get down," he shouted to Lyra. She didn't hesitate. Dropping to the floor, she rolled behind cover, her body instinctively following the command. The sound of blaster fire filled the air as Thorne unleashed a barrage of shots. The Khorax soldier recoiled, but it didn't go down. It charged forward, its blade swinging in a deadly arc. Rax was quick, his massive form moving with surprising agility. He collided with the Khorax warrior, knocking the plasma blade from its grasp and driving his claws into the creature's side. The Khorax let out a terrifying roar, its scales cracking under the force of the blow. But the fight was far from over. More Khorax were coming. Lyra peeked around the corner, her eyes wide as she saw more of the invaders approaching. There were at least a dozen of them, more than they could handle without backup. Her heart raced, but she knew she couldn't just stay behind. This was her fight now, too. "I have an idea," Lyra said, her voice trembling but determined. Thorne turned, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Look," she said, pointing to a large control panel beside her. "If we can reroute the power to the outer turrets, we can take them out before they reach us." Rax shot a glance at Thorne. "She's right. It's risky, but it's our best chance." Thorne nodded. "Do it." Lyra didn't waste a second. She rushed toward the control panel, her fingers flying over the buttons and switches. Her heart raced as the countdown began. The Khorax were closing in. The seconds felt like an eternity. Then, with a sharp hiss of the systems powering up, the outer turrets roared to life. Energy blasts surged toward the incoming Khorax, sending them scattering. The force of the turret's fire was enough to stop their advance, at least for now. The corridor fell silent again, but the battle was far from over. The Khorax had only been pushed back, not defeated. And Lyra knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would decide whether the Akron ship would survive and whether Lyra would have a future beyond the ruins of Zaro. With a deep breath, she readied herself. She wasn't alone anymore, and she was going to make sure the Khorax learned the hard way just how strong humans, and their allies, could be. The battle for survival was just beginning. The blaring sirens had quieted, but the tension aboard the Akron ship was palpable. The battle against the Khorax had only just begun, and despite the brief victory with the turrets, the threat was far from over. The Khorax were relentless. Their bloodthirsty roars echoed through the ship's halls, a constant reminder of their determination. Lyra stood at the helm, her hands trembling but her resolve unshakable. Thorne and Rax had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the ship, preparing for the inevitable push. The outer turrets had bought them some time, but the Khorax had regrouped, and now they were coming in full force. "Stay close," Thorne said, his voice low but commanding as he approached Lyra. His weathered eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. He had seen many battles, but he never underestimated the bravery of those who fought beside him. Lyra nodded silently, her heart pounding as she glanced out of the viewport. The vastness of space stretched before her, and yet she felt a sense of being trapped, an unrelenting pressure from the battle outside, and the cold emptiness that surrounded them. The galaxy had always seemed infinite to her, but now it felt so small, as if it were all closing in around her. Rax's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need a plan. If we're to survive this, we need to get to the core and lock down the defenses." Thorne agreed, his face grim. "We'll need to fight our way through. The Khorax are strong, and they're going to come at us from all sides." Lyra wasn't sure if she was ready for this, ready to face the enemy in the heart of the ship. But something inside her had changed. Since the destruction of Zaro, she had been nothing more than a scared survivor, clinging to life, hiding from danger. But now, she was standing on the precipice of something much bigger. The realization struck her hard. She was not just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her future, for the chance to rebuild, to prove that she was more than the tragedy that had defined her existence. "We'll stick together," Lyra said, her voice steady, more confident than she had felt in weeks. "We can do this." Thorne's lips twitched in a small, approving smile. That's the spirit. The three of them moved quickly down the corridor, the sound of distant explosions shaking the ship. The walls felt alive with the pulse of battle as they advanced toward the heart of the ship. Each step brought them closer to the core, closer to the heart of the conflict. They could feel the heat of the Khorax's presence, growing stronger with every second. Suddenly, the ship's intercom system crackled to life, an eerie, distorted voice echoing through the halls. "Surrender the girl, or face annihilation. This is your final warning." Rax's face darkened. "They think they can intimidate us. They're wrong." Thorne's jaw clenched. "Let's give them a reason to regret that decision." As they rounded a corner, a group of Khorax warriors appeared, their towering forms blocking the path. They were armed to the teeth with plasma rifles, their bodies clad in thick, segmented armor that gleamed with a menacing sheen. The Khorax were tactical, efficient, and brutal, but they had underestimated their opponents. The first Khorax lunged forward with a roar, swinging a plasma sword in a deadly arc. Thorne was faster. He dodged to the side, drawing his blaster in a fluid motion and firing. The blast struck the Khorax directly in the chest, sending it crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. Rax was already in motion, his claws flashing as he barreled into another Khorax warrior, tearing through its armor with terrifying strength. The alien howled in pain, but Rax didn't give it a chance to recover. With one swift motion, he incapacitated the creature, throwing it aside as if it were nothing more than a ragdoll. Lyra, though smaller and less experienced, wasn't just watching. She had learned in the days aboard the ship lessons about survival, about fighting, about standing tall when the world seemed against her. As one of the Khorax advanced toward her, she grabbed a discarded weapon from the floor, a small, energy-based sidearm. Her hand shook, but she raised it, aiming with a determined look in her eyes. The Khorax snarled as it saw her move, rushing in with its bladed weapon. But Lyra had been quick to learn the techniques Thorne had taught her. She fired, a sharp, focused blast hitting the Khorax square in the chest. It staggered back, the armor smoking where the shot had landed. With a final growl, the Khorax fell to the ground. The fight wasn't over. More Khorax were coming, but Lyra's heart raced with a mixture of adrenaline and disbelief. She had done it. She had stood her ground. She had fought back. "Nice shot, kid," Thorne said, offering a rare, approving nod as he cleared the path ahead. "You're stronger than you think." Rax gave her a sharp nod as well, though his expression remained stoic. "Well done. We need to keep moving." They pressed forward, navigating the maze-like corridors of the Akran ship. The battle raged on, with explosions shaking the ship's framework, sending reverberations through the walls. The Khorax were relentless, but Thorne, Rax, and Lyra were a force to be reckoned with. Together, they pushed deeper into the heart of the vessel. As they neared the core of the ship, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that the real test was about to begin. The Khorax were not just invaders, they were conquerors, ruthless and unyielding in their pursuit of dominance. But in that moment, Lyra realized something powerful. This wasn't just about defending a ship or holding back an invasion. It was about something far bigger, an unspoken promise she had made to herself when she first set foot on the Starfire. She was going to survive, not just for herself, but for the memory of her people, the people of Zaro. And no matter what happened next, Lyra wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The deep hum of the ship was all around them as they advanced toward the heart of the Akran ship. The glow of distant red lights illuminated the darkened corridors, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Lyra's heartbeat pounded in her ears, and every step felt heavier than the last. The air smelled of burned metal and tension, thick with the weight of what was coming. But beneath the anxiety, there was also something else, a fire, a purpose, something Lyra hadn't felt since Zaro had burned. Thorne led the way, his battle-hardened eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Rax was right behind him, his movements precise and fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. Lyra trailed them closely, her breath shallow but steady, her pulse quickening as they drew closer to the heart of the ship. They were nearing the core, where the ship's main systems were controlled, and where the Khorax were making their final push. The countdown had begun. "Stay sharp," Thorne muttered, his voice low and rough. "We don't know how many of them are waiting." Lyra nodded, clutching her weapon tightly. She had learned a lot since that first day on the Starfire. How to hold her own in a fight, how to use the ship's systems to survive, how to navigate this vast and unpredictable galaxy. But now, as they neared the core, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about stopping the Khorax from overrunning the entire ship, and beyond that, stopping them from conquering the galaxy. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the sound of Khorax footsteps echoed down the corridor. The Akron ship was becoming a battleground, and Lyra could sense the impending clash. The Khorax were no longer just scattered warriors. They had regrouped, ready for their final assault. The trio reached the blast doors that protected the central control room. Thorne pressed his hand against the panel beside the door, and it slid open with a smooth hiss, revealing the wide, dimly lit control room ahead. The walls were lined with complex consoles and screens that displayed data streams, but the Khorax had already begun to sabotage everything they could reach. Smoke drifted from a few exposed wires, and sparks flew from the terminals, a sure sign of their destructive intent. Lyra stepped into the room first, her eyes scanning the chaos. And there, in the center of it all, stood a figure. Tall, dark-skinned, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp features. The Khorax leader, the one who had led the assault on the Starfire, stood with his arms crossed, observing the devastation with a sinister smile. "Captain Thorne," the Khorax leader called, his voice deep and rich with menace. "I expected no less from you, but your resistance is futile. The Khorax will take this ship, and then the galaxy will fall beneath our rule." Thorne's stance hardened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, a challenge, a promise of a fight that wouldn't end easily. "Not if we can help it," he replied, his voice sharp, resolute. Lyra stood at Thorne's side, ready. She had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain. The Khorax would not take this ship, or the galaxy, without a fight. The Khorax leader laughed, a low, gravelly sound that echoed in the vast control room. He gestured to his warriors, who emerged from the shadows, weapons in hand. "You are brave, but foolish. You think you can stop us." He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at Lyra. "And you, little girl, what do you think you can do?" Lyra's stomach churned, but she didn't flinch. She had faced death before, and she would face it again if it meant protecting what remained of her people, her home. "I may be small," she said, her voice steady, "but you won't break me. Not anymore." Thorne and Rax positioned themselves, ready for the fight. The Khorax leader's eyes narrowed, and with a sharp motion, he ordered his warriors to advance. A flood of them surged forward, and the battle began. Thorne immediately opened fire, his shots finding their mark, taking down two of the Khorax with quick, precise shots. Rax's claws extended, slashing through the air, tearing through armor and bone with terrifying efficiency. But the Khorax were relentless. They fought back with everything they had, their weapons firing in every direction, filling the room with the crackle of energy blasts and the sharp sounds of metal on metal. Lyra stayed close to Thorne, her fingers tight around the weapon she had picked up. She had never fired in a battle like this before, but she knew one thing. She couldn't hesitate. Her people had been wiped out by the Khorax. Her planet, her family, all of it was gone. But here, now, she had a chance to change something. She could fight back. A Khorax warrior lunged at her, its plasma blade glowing with deadly intent. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, but her instincts kicked in. She ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it slashed through the air. Without thinking, she fired her weapon, the shot striking the Khorax in the shoulder. It staggered back, wounded but still standing. Thorne's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep moving. We need to get to the central systems." With a swift motion, Thorne and Rax carved a path through the Khorax warriors, clearing the way toward the core systems. Lyra stayed close, her hands shaking as she fired again, hitting another Khorax soldier. The Khorax leader watched from the back, his expression darkening with each passing second. He wasn't just angry, he was frustrated. The fight wasn't going according to plan. Finally, they reached the central control panel. Thorne slammed his hand onto the console, initiating the override that would lock down the ship's systems and force the Khorax to retreat. But the leader wasn't done yet. He charged forward, his massive form moving with startling speed, and lunged at Thorne. The two collided with a loud crash, Thorne's blaster flying from his hands as the Khorax leader pinned him to the ground. The air seemed to freeze as Lyra watched in horror. This was it. This was the moment everything would end. But then she saw it, an opening. Without thinking, Lyra grabbed a nearby plasma grenade, activated it, and threw it with all her strength. The explosion that followed was deafening, sending shockwaves through the room. The Khorax leader was thrown back, and Thorne rolled to his feet, his expression fierce. Rax didn't waste a second. He leaped into the fray, knocking the Khorax leader off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. With one final push, the Khorax leader was incapacitated, his warriors scattered, retreating in confusion. Thorne breathed heavily, his body bruised but unbroken. Lyra stood next to him, her chest heaving with exhaustion. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Thorne smiled, though it was more of a weary grin. "We're not done yet, but we've won this round." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The galaxy was still a vast, uncertain place, and the war wasn't over. But for now, she had found something she thought was lost forever: hope.